Hello and welcome to this tutorial on node-based surfacing. I'm going to be doing a very simple setup here, which just basically shows you the flexibility of nodes, gradients, vectors and various other bits to achieve things that would be quite difficult to do in layer-based surfacing. And what we're going to do is create an iced cake with various layers of sponge, cream and jam with icing all the way around. Very straightforward, you might think. Okay, and it really quite is. So let's just open up the Surface Editor and select our cake and edit nodes. Get started. Right, we'll just shove this over a layer a bit so we can see what we're doing. So how do we get started? Well, one of the easiest ways of doing things like this, as you probably may be aware from if you've done layer-based surfacing before, is to actually use a gradient. So if we open a gradient and then double click on it to open it up, you can see basically what we have. The various blending, we don't need to worry about that for the moment. Inputs we'll get onto later, but basically you'll notice that there aren't as many in here as there are in the layer-based gradient. That's because you can actually use the input node here to actually create your own systems for how the gradient is driven. And I'll show you that a bit later when we get on to doing some other stuff, but we'll ignore that for the moment. And because we want to basically just working upwards in the cake to create our layers of sponge, cream, jam and then more sponge and a bit of icing on top, we'll just set this to a Y as you might do normally. Right, okay, so first key, let's pick a suitable sponge colour. There we go, and we also want a layer of cream, and we'll set this to step. Then we want another gradient and we want a layer of jam, so we'll set that to red, and again set the gradient to step, and then we want to go back to the sponge. The sponge, gradient, step, and we want a layer of icing on the top. Note obviously it goes from 0 to 1, which in this case with our XY coordinates is 1 is up. So we'll set this to have some nice pink icing. Okay, and again set to step. Right, well if we plug that in, you can see we've got a nice sponge cake. Very straightforward, and that's all just using a single gradient node to control where these various bits and pieces go. So obviously if we want to change them, we could decrease the amount of jam and maybe have a bit more cream or various options like that. That's the very basics. But when you bake a cake, what you have a nice clean cut there where the icing's on the top. You have a nice clean cut there where the cake and the jam are next to each other. You have a nice clean cut there where the cream and the jam are together, because that's all done with knife. But these two, being fluids, they tend to mix. So how do we disturb this to get a bit of interest going on and make it look a bit more fun? Well, one of the easiest way of doing it is just to perturb this value here. And if we look at that, at the moment, it's near enough 50%. But how would we do that? Well, you might think we can just plug a bit of FBM noise in there. Where are we? And if we plug that into there, it all goes horribly wrong. That doesn't work at all. So how do we actually do that? Well, if we double click on this, what we need to do is make this an input. So we can do that just by clicking show output. I know, wrong way. Logic of Lightwave confuses me totally sometimes. But now we have an actual input to control the position, the colour and the alpha for that individual keyframe. So now if we look on the alpha into the position, it's still not quite right, because this is going with the alpha, it's going from 0 to 1 or 0 to 100%, which is not what we want. In this node, we don't actually have any way of controlling the alpha as such. We could sit around and play with the values of these to get the gradients, to get them to near the 50% that we had, but that's actually quite fiddly. There's an easier way of doing it, and we come to a third-party node from DBNW, the wonderful DBNW. And if you look there under maths, we have a remap node. So if we plug this into the scalar input there, notice matching colours, and that into there, into the position, you notice nothing changes. But if we open this up, what we can actually see is this has got an input values, and what it's doing is changing these input values. So from region of 0 to 1, in this case it's not been altered, so it's still changing it from 0 to 1. But knowing that this would, our jam was around 50%, what we can do is say, change this to say 0.47 to 0.53. And now we get a little bit of disturbance in the jam layer. But basically that's because we just need to muck around with the texture of the turbulence. So at the minute it's 1 metre squared. Our cake, by the way, is 1 metre high by 2 metres across. I just did that to keep the maths simple when we actually get around to doing things later on. But obviously when you're building your cake, you would change these to whatever suitable size it was appropriate to. But we'll just say change that to, oh, I don't know, make it a third, 3.3, tab 0.3. And now you can see we've got a nice disturbed layer, an interface between the jam and the cream. This wonderful network there that gives us our jam and the cream. But what about the icing around the outside? Well, this is where the power of vectors and nodes come in really, really useful, because we can actually use a gradient and actually make it map radially from the outside to the inside, going all the way around. So how do we do that, I hear yourself asking? Well, we'll unplug this for the moment and we'll create another gradient. Again, we'll set our 0 value, which is going to be the point nearest to the centre, to the colour of our cake. And we want another icing layer, and again we'll set that to step, so we've got a solid transition between the two. Right, if you look at this, there's nothing here to do with radius from a point. So how do we actually get this to map onto the outside of the cake? Well, if we plug that in, you can see at the moment we've just got a little bit of pink there because it's mapping it in the X direction. Right, let's just get that gradient back. So how do we actually get this to be an input that creates a circle? Well, one of the things that Lightwave has is an object spot on the input, standard input. This is quite hard to describe, but basically it covers any point on the surface of the object that it's referring to. So that's a spot, that's a spot, that's a spot. And it's basically a point or a pixel perhaps that the camera is looking at at any individual time. It produces the information, the location in the object spot as a vector three-dimensional coordinate system. So how do we make that useful for us? Well, you might think first thing is if we just have it coming from a point, but that will actually, the distance from a point, that will actually give us what we need. And there is actually a distance node under math vector. So if we have that, and we have set up a constant scalar to give us our starting position, constant vector, and we'll set that to 0, 0, 0, and plug that in there, and that in there, and the result into the input. And what do we have? Well, this is 0, 0, 0, which is the origin, and it's also the cake is actually set at the origin. So as you can see, what it's doing is mapping a distance 0 to 1, which we had here, and that's just a little bit less than 1. And anything that is above 1 in radius is pink. Anything that is below, or just below the level of 1, is brown, it's cake coloured. But how do we actually make that wrap into a circle? Well, what we really need to do is throw away this part of the vector. So all we want to do is say we don't need the y, which goes up. We just need the x, which goes across, and the z, which goes back. What's the easiest way of doing that? Well, we're going to use another third-party node here. unplug those for the minute. We're going to use a TrueArt tools and split vector. Add a couple of those. And what these do is take a vector or a three-dimensional set of coordinates in it and give us individual x, y and z's. So we plug that into there, or BricsPut into there. Now this gives us our three-dimensional coordinates, and of course we need to get them back into a vector so we can use them in our distance node. So what we need to do is make vector, and that's a standard Lightwave node. So we want to ignore the y, so if we just plug these in, ignoring the y, and plug them in here, you can see we now have our layer of icing around the outside. So how do we actually mix these up and combine these two textures? The one we're actually going to use is the standard Lightwave Tools mixer. Plug that into foreground colour, and plug that into background colour, and plug that in. What do we get? We don't actually get anything at all that we're expecting, because what we need to do is drive the opacity of the mixer node just to actually get the combination between the two materials. Well, if we look at this, a simple way of doing that is to pick that first point and set the alpha to 0. Now, that has completely hidden all the inside stuff because it's all gone to 0 and it's all blacked out. But we don't actually need the inside stuff because that's all here. So if we now plug the alpha into there, we have the iced cake with a filling coming from there and the outside icing around the outside coming from there. And then we're using that to blend the two materials. Got vectors, that's all straightforward. But you may be thinking, why do we actually need this? Because most material, if you don't have an input, we can unplug that and that still works exactly the same. Because this automatically assumes that everything is 0 unless it's told otherwise. It doesn't sort of create any value and just plug it in randomly and to produce an output. If there's nothing plugged in, it always assumes it's 0. But this will come in useful in a minute. So if we close this down, and we'll just go to our scene editor and we'll turn on our piece of cake. Now we want to use this surface on the piece of cake as well. So copy and paste, and that's gone wrong. That's not what we wanted. That's because all of this is more than 1 meter away from the origin of that piece of cake. So this is all pink. And this is where the vector comes in. If we open this node network again, when I created this, I just moved that 1 meter in the Z. So if we go to the vector and change that to -1, all of a sudden it's re-updated all of these values, and now our piece of cake is completely textured the whole way through. And there you go. And that's how to use basic nodes and basic vectors with gradients in Lightwave. And thank you for listening.